Today on The Divide, a look at some of the most divisive public safety bills in Olympia, like an effort to legalize the personal possession of hard drugs.
I think there's pretty much universal agreement that what we're doing is not working.
Plus, a divisive bill brings respectful dialogue.
And I'm really glad that the other side is willing to sit down and have those conversations.
I was grateful to learn from community members, from advocates, from families of police violence along the way, and also learn from law enforcement.
The lesson that all of us can learn from politicians who know that the most important voice is never their own. That and more as we attempt to bridge the divide. Hello and welcome to The Divide. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you're not too cold. Hope you're nice and cozy. We'll talk a little bit about politics. I got a lot of requests from you guys to talk a little bit about what's happening in Olympia. So we wanted to spend the morning looking at some of the more divisive bills being debated down in the current legislative session, including several bills having to do with public safety. One that would decriminalize personal possession of hard drugs. We're going to hear from that bill's prime sponsor later on. But first, House Bill 1054, which would put in place a laundry list of changes to police tactics. Let's familiarize you with the proposals contained in that bill, shall we? Section 2 bans what's commonly referred to as chokeholds. It reads, a peace officer may not use a chokehold or neck restraint on another person in the course of his or her duties. Section 4 bans tear gas. It reads, a law enforcement agency may not purchase, acquire, use, or authorize its peace officers or other employees to use tear gas for any purpose. Section 5 reads, a law enforcement agency may not acquire or use any military equipment, including firearms and ammunition of .50 caliber or greater, machine guns, silencers, armed helicopters, armed or armored drones, armed vessels, armed vehicles, armed aircraft, tanks, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, long-range acoustic hailing devices, rockets, rocket launchers, bayonets, grenades, grenade launchers, missiles, directed energy systems, and electromagnetic spectrum weapons. And now, there was one more section of that bill I want to talk about. And it was actually what we intended to do our entire show about today, because I got so many emails from you guys about this. This section, perhaps more controversial than the rest, it was Section 3. Take a look. It read, past tense, as follows. A peace officer may not use a police dog for the purpose of arresting or apprehending another person. So it looked to ban the use of police canines for making arrests. This was highly controversial, especially, as you can imagine, in the law enforcement community. But after hearing concerns from law enforcement about that section, Democrats behind the bill decided to hit pause and instead take some time to really study best practices for police dogs. I spoke with Republican State Representative Gina Mosbrecher, ranking member of the House Public Safety Committee.
It's my understanding that there's been a change in that, and Democrats are willing to step back from that. How'd that come about?
Absolutely, and we're very grateful for that. That was very contentious, and that was an area we weren't willing to move on. These canines, as you know, if you see a canine, you kind of develop a relationship. You want to pet it, even in some instances you can't. You want to, it mends that hate and that breakdown of the relationship that we've had between law enforcement and communities. So we see it as a tool to bind people, to bring people together. And these dogs save lives. These dogs they're risking their life every day, just like an officer. They're one of the most highly trained officers, in a sense, in most places. They have so much training and ongoing training every day. I have a Belgian Malinois, half German Shepherd. I love this area of the bill because this is related to what I go through every day. My dog went to training for 6 weeks, but it has that nature of high energy and it wants to work. These dogs are really focused. They're focused on their task. We would argue that they're an asset. They save law enforcement's off. They give them the ability to not use other legal means or lethal means that would harm somebody. They give them opportunity to de-escalate, right?
So there's now going to be this group that comes together, it looks like, to sort of decide, okay, how can we make sure that there are best practices around the use of police canines? From what you've read about the individuals who would comprise that group, do you think it's going to be a fair assessment?
I do. I just got it very recently within the hour. So we're going to look through it. I do think there's more people that should be at the table. One should be the Washington State Police Canine Association. They're experts in this. They use the science. I think somebody from that WSPCA should be at the table. I think making sure that somebody who has a success story about how because of the canine, either the officer was saved or a civilian was saved. So I think it could be a little more balanced, but we just got it. And I'm really excited that they're willing to make that concession in order to really dive into it before we just ban canines in the state of Washington.
Let me ask you, Representative, did they have to? Did Democrats have to make that concession, or would
No.
they have had enough votes?
They absolutely have enough votes. So we're grateful that they listened to emails, they listened to us in this sense, and we were able to go back to the table. They even allowed stakeholder meetings of canine handlers who were experts and handle a canine daily, a couple different meetings late at night on Zoom from across the state of Washington who were able to weigh in on why this is important and what their concerns were. And we didn't have any that weren't willing to do more training.
Gotcha. Well, that's pleasant to hear.
We did.
I like hearing examples of people working together. That's what our show's about.
That's our job, right?
It should be, ideally.
That is their job. I do like hearing about that. So on this police canine proposal, Mossbrecher, as we were chatting, she was really complimentary of the bill's sponsor, Democratic State Representative Jesse Johnson of Federal Way. She says he and other Democrats involved truly took the time to consider whether this canine section and the limits it put on the use of police dogs was the best path forward. I spoke with Representative Johnson about those discussions.
What's this I hear about you being willing to listen to people's concerns? I didn't know politicians did that.
Well, I want to begin by saying some of the controversy that we've heard around this issue is really due to our dark history of this country around using dogs for slave patrols, attacking civil rights protesters, and against the Black community in general. The bill already would have allowed for canine use in like drug detection or search for missing persons. But after hearing from so many canine advocates across the state, law enforcement directly and other stakeholders, we saw the value in using canine units to track suspects, especially when you're in a dangerous situation or a difficult to navigate environment. So working with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to craft an amendment that scales back this ban and instead focus on reducing overall rates of dog bites. We want to address the racial disproportionality that exists and also want to provide more training for our canine handlers, which is something they asked for as well. I was grateful to learn from community members, from advocates, from families of police violence along the way, and also learn from law enforcement. And I think that, this bill is going to be important overall. And so looking at the larger picture, the canine part was a huge part of what we were seeing in terms of opposition. So we wanted to enhance the bill. And I think also when talking with the Criminal Justice Training Commission, there wasn't a consistent use across the state of Washington. And so they're going to develop a model policy with stakeholders from the community and bring all voices to the table to address those concerns. So I think it's going to make a united front in the end.
How long do you expect that process to take? Some people hear working groups or whatever, and these things just go on forever. So from your mind, what do you want that process to look like? And when do you expect to have some concrete recommendations from them?
I would probably give them at least a year. I think coming back to the legislature next session makes sense. Obviously, you want to put something in place sooner, but it's important to get the policy right. And that makes us less divided when the policy is right. So I think the overall bill seeks to accomplish preservation of life as a primary value for our officers. So I think we're going to take about a year to get it right, work with the CJTC, work with community, and come back next year with a recommendation.
Like we saw with the canine section, and obviously that is coming out now much different than how it was initially proposed. Are there any other remaining aspects or sections to the bill that you do believe could undergo a fundamental change before a vote is taken?
I would say we are going to look at the military equipment list again. There's a couple circumstances where we may provide a provision like the use of silencers, for example. We already removed armored equipment and armored vehicles and helicopters from the list because they provide a safety mechanism for officers going into a dangerous situation. But we'll look at that list as well. I'd also say on the tear gas issue, there has been some pushback on the use for barricaded suspects or even for demonstrations and protests. My thought is I do think there's a list of other less lethal alternatives. There's flash grenades, there's rubber bullets, there's obviously tasers and PA systems, but I think we'll look at tear gas really closely, and especially for like demonstrations and protests. Sometimes it's really difficult, and if there is a supervisory level that would authorize tear gas from a top level down, that when you're in a situation that presents an imminent threat, I think we can look at that and maybe provide a provision on that. But I think we're gonna have to look at really closely. You're gonna have to look at that really closely to make sure that it's, you know, really restrictive still. So I would say the tear gas, the military list are probably the only two sections that we'll probably look further deeper on.
These lawmakers don't even need me anymore. They're just bridging their own divide. So I'm going to be out of business soon. I actually do think, though, just after, because we started the show and planning for the show this week to talk about just how divisive this canine bill was. And then both sides kind of came together on it and decided on a path forward. And I actually think there's a really valuable lesson from the debate over this bill that we can all learn from. I'm going to have more on that in my closing commentary. But first, a bill to legalize personal drug possession in our state. The bill's lead sponsor joins us to explain her rationale. Stick around. It is hands down one of the most divisive bills being considered in Olympia right now, a proposal to decriminalize the personal possession of hard drugs. Washington would become the second state to do this if it passes, behind Oregon, which made that move earlier in the year. Now this, by the way, it includes everything. We're talking heroin, meth, cocaine, mushrooms, you know the kind. You know the kind I'm talking about, not the kind you buy in the grocery store. So the rationale behind House Bill 1499 is as follows, per the bill. Arrest and incarceration do not treat the root causes of substance use disorder. Treating substance abuse disorder like a crime through arrest and incarceration further disrupts and destabilizes the lives of these individuals. I spoke with the bill's main sponsor, State Representative Lauren Davis of Shoreline.
The bill really looks at creating an architecture for responding to substance use disorder in our state. I think there's pretty much universal agreement that what we're doing is not working. We have lots of individuals suffering. We have impacts on community, impacts on public safety and public health due to untreated addiction. And so it's really about creating a statewide plan for substance use disorder response that involves all sorts of folks, law enforcement, addiction treatment experts, bringing everyone to the table to come up with a plan to really do it right. And what that plan looks like is funding the entire continuum of substance use disorder care. So really from outreach, so going out proactively into encampments and engaging people, building relationships to bring them into services, the treatment, which is the only part that we currently do fund, and then the recovery support services, which is the entire suite of non-treatment services that are really critical to keeping people in recovery. So things like recovery housing and access to educational and employment pathways. And so it basically builds this architecture, funds this architecture, and then after a 2-year period that we have built this much more robust, proactive system to engage folks with substance use disorder into care, at that time we will then stop incarcerating people for simple possession, so for having drugs on their person. It's really about making sure that we're responding to this as a brain disease. It's a chronic, progressive, treatable brain disease, and these individuals are deserving of, worthy of, and capable of recovery.
Given the fact that the need on the front end of all the other things that you talk about is non-controversial and absolutely urgent, why even bother tying it to something, even if it would kick in 2 years later, like the decriminalization of hard drugs? Why not do that thing first, reassess in 2 years, and see whether that second priority of yours is feasible?
We're not taking away an effective tool. Currently, today, individuals who are arrested for possession, they spend very few days in jail, and then they are released. So there's no connection to services whatsoever. They are then released. They're given a court date. They generally don't show up, and then a warrant is issued for a failure to appear. And there's just all sorts of court costs, law enforcement costs, and this person does not get connected to services. There are certainly programs through the criminal legal system that can lead to long-term sustained recovery, like drug court, for example. We don't generally send felony possession cases to drug court. Drug court is really reserved for complex cases, things like residential burglary, multiple felonies. So these individuals that we're talking about are not getting services vis-a-vis a felony possession charge. What they're getting is a stamp on their back for the rest of their lives that renders it difficult to get employment, difficult to get housing. And so everything that they're going to try to do in recovery is infinitely harder by having this felony conviction that they're carrying around for the rest of their lives.
Is there any remedy, if this bill goes through, for an individual who is repeatedly caught with illicit drugs, is repeatedly let off, and repeatedly declines to get help or treatment?
The individuals that you're describing who are going to have repeatedly coming into contact perhaps with law enforcement in possession are individuals who likely are going to be probably committing some of the other crimes that are common amongst this population, property crimes, theft, criminal trespass, and they are going to be caught up in our criminal legal system that way. And perhaps, prosecutors have more teeth in some ways. They have more leverage when it's a higher level crime. Felony possession, simple possession, there's not a lot of leverage for a prosecutor to compel or incentivize someone into treatment in our current model. So the population you're describing, the kind of repeated folks, are going to have other pathways vis-a-vis the criminal legal system with accountability for treatment. Those are the folks that might be eligible for drug court, those sorts of problems. But the reality is a very large majority of this population would respond incredibly well to the intervention that I'm describing. It's just that we never funded them. And again, for individuals with extremely severe substance use disorder, they can be civilly committed. So also a non-criminal legal system pathway under Ricky's law through the Involuntary Treatment Act into substance use disorder treatment that way.
Wouldn't it be more effective to mandate treatment, if that treatment is the goal, to mandate treatment in exchange for dropping a criminal charge or a civil infraction?
Sure. So great question. And that's not really an option. So let me break it down for you. So currently, if somebody is facing a felony possession charge, the prosecutor may try to get them in, even if they tried to get them into like a drug court or a mental health court. Those are 2-year programs that are very intensive. The person is facing a choice of, gee, I could do, 5 or 10 days in jail, or I could do 2 years of this intensive program with multiple year analyses, and they're frequently going to choose jail. And so this idea, we don't have that capability to mandate treatment pre-trial, and we also don't have it to mandate treatment vis-a-vis sentencing for this particular type of crime. So what we're doing currently is not leading to treatment engagement.
So I'm sorry, if people would rather spend 5 to 10 days in jail than embark on a difficult treatment program, which any treatment program is going to be difficult, why would saying you don't have to spend any time in jail encourage them to embark on a difficult treatment program?
Because the treatment programs that I just mentioned are really still based in that criminal legal system model. It's very much a stick approach, and people respond to a carrot approach. And when you have someone walk alongside them and say, hey, what's important to you? Like, are you enjoying your life right now? And the answer is universally no. What would you like? What would you like to be different? And then actually help them figure out the path and then walk along the path to get there is incredibly powerful, and it works. We just never funded it. That's not the system that we built.
All right, so we wanted to see what some of you think about this proposal. I was expecting a lot more negative reaction. I mean, I did get some of that. Paul wrote on my Facebook page, there's definitely a double standard for those that respect the law and those that don't. Devin wrote, spend the money on mandatory treatment centers instead of prison, so it seems to be in favor of this proposal. Lenny, this is extremely unkind and unloving to those who are suffering with addiction, and I will, say, having spoken to family members of people who have overdosed, many of them feel that way as well. Craig, it is basically like this in Seattle already, maybe not on the books, but de facto. That's That's true, Craig. I think that's a fair argument. And if this is a subject that really interests you, you can catch more of my conversation with Representative Davis tomorrow on the Divide podcast. Make sure to download and subscribe. All right, coming up after the break, breaching the divide isn't always pretty and it's not always kind, but rejecting fringe ideas and listening to each other is key to functioning again as a society. Stick around. I was fully prepared this week to talk about the controversy over a proposal in Olympia having to do with police canines. House Bill 1054 would have prohibited the use of police dogs in apprehending suspects. Some in law enforcement were upset by that and argued that using a canine to make an arrest can mean the difference between life and death, not only for the officer, but at times for the suspects. So we were going to do a whole story on the divisive nature of this proposal, on some of the fringe comments floating around about it, until lawmakers in Olympia went ahead and found common ground without us.
We were frustrated, but they listened.
That is Republican State Representative Gina Mossbrecher, who was against the proposal. She says Democrats listened to concerns over the bill, actually took them to heart, and decided to go in a different direction. State Representative Jesse Johnson is the bill's sponsor.
I was grateful to learn from community members, from advocates, from families of police violence along the way, and also learn from law enforcement.
And this, ladies and gentlemen, is how a debate should work. Of course, it's a debate over dogs that brings people together. No surprise there. But more than that, here you have an example of two lawmakers who realize that their opinion isn't the only opinion that matters. They realize, in fact, that they might actually be able to learn something by listening to other people, that they might actually be able to come up with a better bill if they hear the other side out. For Representative Mossbrecher, that means acknowledging that policing isn't perfect, and maybe there are some changes that can make it better.
We have a lot of work to do to make sure we're using the least lethal and the officers are trained and that we have good officers.
For Representative Johnson, it means recognizing that he isn't doing his job unless he's doing it with all of his constituents in mind.
We have a saying in the Black community, lift every voice, and every voice has to be lifted up. And so that means even the voices you don't want to hear, you can't just stay in the echo chamber.
Now, that doesn't mean that lawmakers are always going to be willing to budge from their initial ideas. But the only way to know whether our ideas can be improved is if we stop talking long enough to actually listen. All right, thanks for joining us on The Divide. Did you like my little doggone delightful? Did you think that was creative? No? Okay. I just, there's not too many examples of politicians down in Olympia, or really in the country, who are willing to come together on something that divisive and to work through it, especially considering Democrats didn't really have to, right? They are in control in Olympia. They could have pushed that thing through, but they wanted to hear feedback. They wanted to hear from stakeholders. So we'll see what comes of that bill. I think next session, after this working group gets together, they're going to reassess and probably come out with a different proposal to mandate some standards in regards to canines statewide. But it's not going to happen this year. So next year, we'll be sure to follow up on that. As always, I do welcome your feedback. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, send me an email, thedivide@fox.com. And don't forget, we do have a new podcast that posts every Monday. You can listen to the entire show in podcast form, but we also post extended interviews like some of the interviews you saw today on our show. So be sure to download and subscribe. I'll see you tomorrow on Q13 News This Morning.